I'm Sarah Mock, and welcome to Crusonia Conversations, a forum bringing together entrepreneurs, innovators, and experts in ag, food, and health, a group passionate about the fundamental belief that food is health.
Thanks, Sarah. I'm Carter Williams, CEO of iSelect. We focus on hard problems. One of those hard problems is Americans spend $1.6 trillion every year on food, but spend nearly $2 trillion on diet-related illnesses like type 2 diabetes, obesity, and cardiovascular disease. Each of these is fatal in their own rights. They're more fatal when you're comorbidities for COVID-19. These are tough problems. At iSelect, we believe if you want any hard problem solved, you give it to an entrepreneur. We believe that you cannot solve the healthcare challenge we face without the evolution to a new, better, and more nutritious food system. Our work at iSelect and the broader work we're doing with Crusonia is focused on bringing the right people together to make this happen, to affect the change, to bring entrepreneurs forward, large corporations, healthcare systems, and patients together to make real progress, to solve the problem associated with healthcare, to introduce better food, to make it so that food and health are combined as a solution to improve our quality of life. Our hope is that results are measured not only through the traditional financial metrics, but through a fundamental and positive impact on reversing the footprint and impact of diet-related illness.
Hello, and welcome back to Crusonia Conversations, where entrepreneurs, experts, and investors explore change in the global food system. I'm Sarah Mock, your host for today's discussion. Today, we're talking about changing perceptions and demands in food preparation and education spaces, particularly for members of Generation Z. Now, there's a lot of tension and opportunity to change these conversations happening around changing nutritional preferences and habits, and to push ahead with more plant-forward and health-conscious approaches. To help us dive into how younger generations are driving shifts in food and culinary spaces, we're joined today by chef educators Ken Rubin and Dan Marek. Chef Ken Rubin is an educator, food anthropologist, and Chief Culinary Officer at Rouxbe Online Culinary School. He has developed ethnographic research methods to understand how people learn to cook and is recognized for his expertise in education and training, food culture research, health, wellness, and product development. We also have joining us Chef Dan Marek. He runs the Whole Kids Foundation's Healthy Teachers Program, which is designed to provide teachers and school staff with nutrition, inspiration, and healthy cooking techniques to transform their own well-being, serve as healthy role models for their students, and be change agents in their own communities. Dan is also a board member of Slow Food Austin. Now, before we dive into some questions with both Dan and Ken, thank you both for joining us. But just a little bit of information for our folks joining us live today. Please let us know what your questions are. You can go ahead and put those into the chat feature right in your web platform. As those come up, I'll be voicing those to our panelists here and asking your questions live. So make sure you include your name and organization so that we can recognize where the question is coming from, and just keep those coming throughout the conversation. So now that we've got a bit of housekeeping cleared up, Dan, Ken, thank you both so much for being here. I kind of want to start this conversation with just asking the both of you, this conversation is driven so much by change and how things are changing right now. From the both of your perspectives, what's the most important difference in this new young generation when it comes to food, where they kind of set themselves apart from the generations that came before them?
Well, I think that this generation has got a pretty big difference between the one from before them, because they've really grown up in a different way than the generation before them. It's a much more interactive with videos, looking up things on YouTube. I always say that the previous generation grew up with Barney, and this generation grew up with people like Alton Brown. Having chefs as something to look up to is a pretty big change. And that has led to kids really being interested in food, not only flavor profiles and textures, but knowing where the food is coming from, where it's being grown, how it's being grown. And it's a pretty big difference that's happening in that generation that is adversely also, it's actually affecting their parents at the same time, because the kids are getting so much information on it as well.
Yeah, that's a great comment, Dan. I'll just add to that I think that there is an amazing transformative effect when you have this intergenerational sort of combination of things that are happening at the same time. You have boomers who are aging and realizing the effects of food on their health. You have younger people being raised in a new media landscape, a new environment where food is about more than just a chef and the food on the plate in front of you, but also about the story of the food, how it got to us, the environment and health and other stories. So part of what I think is driving this is really a combination of factors. Certainly younger people are driving a lot of the change, but that also comes in a context of what came before and what's going to happen next.
Absolutely. So many interesting kind of things to tee off on there, but I want to start by talking about something that both of you care a lot about, which is the idea of one of these transitions, which is newer generations being more interested in scratch cooking versus maybe opening a box or doing a reheated or prepared food. Talk to us a little bit about what's driving that change and what it means in terms of maybe different outcomes for health, nutrition, kind of all those related factors.
And I'll let you jump in there first.
Sure. Yeah. So with Whole Kids Foundation, we also run a program specifically for schools that are wanting to go back to scratch cooking. And it's kind of a big thing to be able to jump on because, it's not like just a light switch where you can just turn it on and instantly the next day you're doing all scratch cooking. It's more kind of like a lever that takes time to be able to pull from one side to the other, making these huge changes in procurement to, just actual culinary techniques that the staff has to learn from just opening a box and heating it up. And that change is actually, we're finding it happening all over the country, where schools are wanting to go back to scratch cooking. And that is being, that's being demanded basically by the kids and the parents. And that's why they're making these big changes. And it's just something where we've kind of learned in nutrition that you're going to get a better nutrition out of something that's actually more fresh, directly, the farm to table thing is a very real thing that schools like to, try to focus on. They can't go 100% farm to table, but they can make some of those connections with farms a little bit better as well. So that transformation of just the school system, where a lot of kids depend on where they get their food from, making that systematic change across the entire country is really helping to kind of move that lever towards scratch cooking, both, for the kids at the school, but also looking at what opportunities they can do that at home in the same way.
Yeah, I'll just add, I've always been fascinated by this idea of scratch cooking and sort of the underpinnings of that, and making a hard distinction between processed food in a box and scratch cooking. I think there's a lot of things that are in between there that allow people to step into cooking and not feel as intimidated or scared. I think one of the things I've learned in all the time I've spent as an advocate for cooking and for scratch cooking is the reality that people face, this tension of cooking something from scratch in its entirety, and then some of the time or the lack of skills, lack of availability, even of the acquisition of certain ingredients or the skills themselves in there. But I think that, the work that I'm doing with Rouxbe and the work that Dan does certainly is all pushing towards that. It's all pushing towards a world where we can, begin to kind of normalize this idea that food comes whenever possible, as much as possible, in a more whole form, and that a human being, a community, has a collective responsibility for preparing those foods and serving those foods and sharing those foods. And that there's a lot of inherent good that comes in maintaining some of those cultural rituals and those cultural norms around how meals are prepared and shared and the value that we attribute to the act of eating. So for me, it's not just about the importance of cooking. I mean, Rouxbe is really about cooking and cooking technique and unlocking that world for people. But there are such other implications for agriculture, for community, for families, when you think about cooking, not just in terms of the final result, the meal on the table, but also all the important things that have to happen along the way.
Yeah, Ken, I want to keep you in the hot seat for a minute, and talk a little bit about that full spectrum, because I think there is a lot of focus, especially in this space, on the distance between that kind of box cooking versus scratch cooking. But on your side of the spectrum, there's also the difference between, you know, at-home scratch cooking and professional chef cooking. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how that gap between, you know, fancy, high culinary art cooking and the distance between that and home cooking, and then also between box cooking, creates, you know, some, or perpetuates some of the disparities or problems we see in people feeling like scratch cooking is accessible.
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there is obviously some tension in there. You know, my background as a chef and chef educator, you know, starting with large, you know, brick and mortar professional chef schools, and then about 8 years ago moving to Rouxbe, really helped inform the way I see the role of the chef, even the role of the chef as the spokesperson in some ways, in terms of communicating things around cooking and the need for cooking. You know, one of the things that I've always advocated for, and I think this is not necessarily indicative of how, you know, rank and file people view chefs or view the food media, is that there are, you know, millions and millions of people who work with food, who are not producing fancy food. They're not producing elite food. They're producing everyday food for everyday people. And they're doing it day in and day out. We don't know their names. They're not on the cover of Time magazine. They're not celebrities. They're just rank and file people who are doing their job and doing a good job at it, and making families and communities really happy with more regular food. And a lot of what we do at Rouxbe is really, we train people at that most basic entry level. So the work at Rouxbe is not about training Michelin chefs or fancy chefs. Most of the people that we work with on the professional side are rank and file cooks. They're line cooks. They work in community centers. They work in hospitals. They work in hotels. You know, all different kinds of settings where people are needing to have food. You know, universities, campus dining, these sorts of things. I think that there is a role to have, you know, well-known chefs, chef spokespeople, advocates promote food that is at a high level. It does speak to aspiration and excitement and innovation. But I think that that's actually one of the areas where I try to move away from and say, you know, most food that we eat is not that food. It's comforting food. It's food that has to be realistic on cost, on time, on how we handle it, on even what it means to us culturally. A lot of those, you know, high cuisines are just, it's more like theater. It's not necessarily something that resonates at that deeper cultural level for people. So I think it's important, but, you know, I always try to shift the conversation more towards what are those more everyday eating experiences that we need to improve, and how does Rouxbe play a hand in providing better educational access to those people.
Yeah, Dan, I want to bring you into that same conversation, and just, you know, from the educational perspective, I think that also kind of creates a barrier, because when people think of educating students or children about cooking, it's often is framed as this, like, you know, if it can't become a career, if they can't become professional chefs, then what's the point? I'm sure you don't believe that. You don't ascribe to that. Give us a little bit of the other side of, you know, why should kids learn about cooking, whether or not they can monetize it, essentially?
And just the simple need to feed yourself, I think, is the number one reason. I think that, you know, in the 1950s, America really started kind of, I don't want to say dumbing down, but that's basically what it was, their food, to be able to make it really quick and easy. And now we're looking at ways to be able to educate the kids, parents, just all kinds of people on just the basic things of just kind of things like knife skills, like how to be able to hold a knife, how to be able to cut different ingredients, how to do it quickly and easily to be able to make meals that the whole family can enjoy. We find in a lot of schools where they're used to opening just boxes and heating it up in the oven, that they, finding a regular chef knife in the kitchen is really hard to do in some schools. So just starting with that little point of showing people how to, how to cut an onion properly, how to dice up a pepper is a really good start. And for kids, it's a great way for them to be exploring food in a different way that an older generation might not have. Sometimes in an older generation, it was looked down upon a little bit to be able to be cooking. And people were like, oh, no, I don't cook. And they took that as a pride factor. This generation looks at it the exact opposite way, saying like, no, I actually know how to do this. I actually can make this food. And it's a wonderful thing to be able to see. And that kind of stretch between, the box cooking to complete scratch cooking, as Ken said, there's a wide variety of things in between that. One of the techniques being like, speed scratch, which is very common in a lot of schools too, where you're not maybe making the tomato sauce from scratch, but you're making everything else in that lasagna from scratch. And that's a great step. We want to be able to have people be able to take it where it's comfortable for them to be able to make that happen. And part of this is learning along the way. So, if you're teaching kids, that's great. A lot of people, are really reluctant to, giving kids tools to be able to cook, but it's something, as long as you're teaching them how to properly use them, it can be a game changer for them. And really taking that knowledge can help them throughout their lives, from going, when they go off to college or leave the house. Having those skills when they first leave their home is something that I think is essential to everybody. And it's really, it's great that that's coming more into focus now, to be able to give that option to so many kids. And using those whole foods is a great cost productive way to do it, but also really focusing at health and nutrition, and looking at being able to get a wide variety of nutrients from your food is a great place to be able to start.
Absolutely. I want to bring in we're getting some great comments from folks who are following along. Leslie Bonchi, commented on, it's not just about, fresh or whole. It's also about what people can afford and what the budget is. And she pressed about being more all-encompassing and less elitist in our food. And I think that's a great jumping off point to have that conversation about accessibility. I think Pablo Velasquez also notes, 35% of the people in a survey in Memphis who responded about why they don't cook said it's because they only have a microwave at home. There's all these kind of perceived barriers out there, and a lot of conversations I think around cooking kind of come down to, if you care enough, you'll make it work, or if you care enough, you'll figure out how to afford the food or the tools or the time. Talk a little bit about, the real barriers that people face, and what, what you guys think are potential solutions maybe that exist out there, and how you're even working on these problems.
Well, yeah, it's great. It's a great conversation. I think that the issue of equity of access and the equity of cooking is one that is, ever more present right now, more than any other time, really, for many reasons. Part of what I think about when I think about food is the entire food system. And there are absolutely points of access, points of infrastructure that are completely broken. I think that the pandemic has, put a big spotlight on how various parts of our food system, from start to finish, were really very, very fragile. I think that when it comes to learning to cook, one of the things that we focus on at Rouxbe is really meeting people where they are. So number one, it used to be that you had to go to a culinary school and you'd have to spend a lot of money, tens of thousands of dollars, potentially go into debt to get that cooking education. Rouxbe is trying to work away from that, both in the professional and the workforce side, but also just hey, how do you get access to quality instruction? So part of it is, what do you do when you get those ingredients? Part of it is, the way we like to teach is, if you have a knife and a pot and a pan and a heat source, there's a whole range of things that we can teach you to cook. on a budget, on, just a few dollars, let's just say. Of course, there's always access about where do you get those ingredients, or how do you get those legumes or those frozen vegetables, even whatever it might be. But ultimately for us, it's all about trying to find and create solutions for those people so that if they do have the access, if they do have a way to, receive those ingredients, if they do have a single burner or a microwave or a toaster oven or some other heat source, that there are things that they can actually reasonably prepare. For me, nothing's off limits. When students come to us and they say, hey, I want to learn to cook with you, I live in an apartment with one burner, I don't have an oven, what do I do? Oftentimes we can say, wow, you can still do this large percentage of the course. There's all the things you can do with literally just a burner and a pan, and learn to cook and feed yourself and show a lot of success. For a lot of people, I think the conversation, the meta narrative around food is one of being defeated and having barriers and having fears. So I find that when you give people even small wins, it gives them that optimism and that inspiration to say, wow, yeah, I learned to cook these 10 things just in a single frying pan with a knife and a cutting board. Like, that's amazing. Now I can do all these different things. Sometimes it's very, very eye-opening to people. I don't think it's intuitive, by the way, for people to say, oh, I have a pan and a knife, here's the 100 things I can make. I think it takes some instruction. I think it takes some hand-holding. It takes some support, some motivation. It has to be done in a way that makes sense for that audience. Oftentimes peer-to-peer helps, but none of those things are without, finding some good opportunity for overcoming those different challenges.
I also, just to add on to what Ken said here too, access is always one of those hard things as well. So not only just to the tools, and I completely agree with Ken. And I think that, starting out with like a 10 recipe kind of repertoire is a great thing to do, where you start off with one recipe and then start adding things to it. So you can start planning out your weeks a little bit better. So you're not wasting as much food as well. So you can plan ahead when you're doing things. As far as food access goes too, there are some great opportunities. You had mentioned Memphis, Tennessee. I know, our sister organization, Whole Cities Foundation, has given some grants to some local organizations like Knowledge Quest and Landmark Training and Development Company that runs food pantries and farmers markets there specifically, that, cater to, these areas that they can actually, get fresh produce that they might not have been able to get. And there are great opportunities there too, where they're, accepting different things like SNAP at food pantries and different farmers markets to be able to make fresh produce more accessible. There's also, you'd mentioned plant-based at the beginning too. That's actually a great place to be able to focus. Like how much like dried beans and dried rice cost to be able to make is a relatively cheap undertaking to be able to start off with something like that. In our school systems, the average lunch is about $2 to $2.50 per kid. So if you think about how to be able to make that in mass to be able to transfer, you can make that happen at home pretty easily too. So just knowing a couple rudimentary skills, and like Ken said, having a little bit of instruction around where to kind of start really helps to give people wings a little bit, so they can take recipes and alter them to be able to make them with the ingredients that they have accessible to them, and to fit different flavor profiles at the same time. Because at the end of the day, it has to taste really good for people to be able to enjoy their food, not just getting the nutrients out of it. So just taking those small amount of steps by learning a couple different recipes, looking for opportunities that you can actually get food that's affordable and really nutritious at the same time. So part of that comes with a little bit of nutrition education too. So, at Whole Kids, we do a lot of education for teachers so they can be better mentors to kids through food about their own nutrition, so they can really start off by having a good basis of this is a great basis. We have one of our golden rules is eat a rainbow, and that basically equates to the more you eat different colors, the more vitamins and nutrients you're actually getting. So just thinking about different things like that when you're buying things at the market, at the grocery store, even at a bodega, being able to look at different things to be able to really fill up your palate for one, but also get all the nutrients that you're looking for on affordable and easy way to be able to make that happen.
Uh, Thanks again, Leslie and Pablo, for those comments. Please, folks, keep those coming. Any questions or comments you'd have, we love to make them a part of this conversation. But first, I'm going to ask, take my moderator's prerogative and ask a really important question, I think, especially at this moment. I think for so many of the communities that would be so impacted by, a more nutritious diet, a more nutritious, more investment in just food security, sovereignty, all of those things, are primarily people of color and communities of color here in the US. Memphis is a great example. I think the three of us are a particularly homogenous group of white people. And I think that's a critique that we hear a lot of the kind of these food education discussions is basically it's being led by a lot of white male voices, when so much of the cooking and responsibility for cooking and grocery shopping and feeding families and children falls primarily on the shoulders of women and people of color. So I wonder if you could speak to how you guys struggle with that in your work, how you've faced that, and what does that mean for how this conversation needs to proceed?
Yeah, it's an important question. It's an important commentary, I think, in terms of where we are right now as a country and the things that matter for people. It's something that I've been interested in and struggled with for a long time. Being a chef, being a food anthropologist, working a lot of my life outside the U.S. and doing a lot of work specifically with women, with Mexican women, with indigenous women, in terms of my own work, my own research. These are not new questions, but we don't have the answers. I don't have the answers. So part of why I do the work I do at Rouxbe is because of the implicit ability for us to level the playing field and increase access, to take what would have been in the past a $50,000 or $80,000 experience and giving it to people at a cost at that $1,000 price point potentially. So there's not the debt, there's not the risk, there's not those other things, but there's all the upside. Working directly with employers has been important with us because we see that part of the solution is coming from the industry itself. It's not a top-down, hey, we're the educators and we're going to teach the world, and then that's going to kind of trickle into the industry. We think the industry bears a responsibility to train and to advance individuals from within the ranks, and we do a lot of that by how we structure our training and how we price it and work with our large partners all around the world. We have tens of thousands of employees. And I think another area is really our work with high schools and community colleges and community kitchens. Even before the pandemic, Rouxbe was very invested in working with organizations like Fair Start and Catalyst Kitchen and DC Central Kitchen and lots of regional food banks to provide that culinary instruction piece that we knew was missing. So in other words, when they get access to product and there's people in need who receive material to cook with, a lot of it was, well, what do I do with it? How do I cook these whole foods and make sense with it in a culturally competent way? So I think, by no means as a white male of privilege who is in a position to help orchestrate these things do we have solutions, but we're certainly making a lot of efforts. And I think having these conversations in an open, authentic way is part of the way there. But certainly a lot to still do.
I'd like to add on to that too. At Whole Kids Foundation, we really try to focus on who isn't at the table. No pun intended at that, and what voice is really not being represented in the room, and how can we meet them where they are? Like, what barriers are in their way as well? And each of those is a unique situation that you have to address. And it's going to be different in every single community. So if you're going to work in a community, you have to think about the diversity and the cultures of that community to be able to meet them where they are. Because, Ken and I going into, a different restaurant or a different, school system, or, some of the work that Ken does with different hotel systems, the food and the culture in those cities is vastly different than just the one that could just be 100 miles away. And looking at that diversity is something that makes that community that much stronger. So I think that, in the positions that we are in personally, that we have to be able to look at that first and foremost before even, opening the door, to be able to look at what the standout, dishes, cuisines, cultures, all those different things are, because really at the end of the day, it's that diversity that really makes up that culture of the community and really helps to bring everybody to the table. And by keeping an eye out for who isn't being represented at that table, and then making sure that you're actually pulling them into it, even if they can't physically be there, talking to them to be able to help, tell their story at the same time, I think is something that is hugely our responsibility, at this moment, to be able to bring that in, where we can step back and let somebody else's voice just come through much, much clearer.
Absolutely. We have another question. I think that I'm interested to hear your responses to, because keeping in mind that a big part of the Crusonia community is our folks in the investment space who are looking for ways to leverage financial investments, nonprofit investments, kind of social impact investments to really make a big impact, a quick impact, as soon as we can, to work on some of these issues. Pablo Velasquez said again at LifeDoc Health that they're working on a way to launch self-sustainable prepared meals that are tasty, affordable, and convenient in some of the neighborhoods where they see these challenges. What are your guys' thoughts on those kind of solutions? Is a Blue Apron style cooking kit that is maybe priced in a different way to make it more accessible to people who maybe don't have time or the resources to go grocery shopping, or who live in communities where there's kind of food apartheid? What do you guys see out there as kind of new, innovative, cutting edge solutions of people who are tackling some of these problems in a different way?
Dan, you want to go ahead? Sure. I think that when it comes to things like Blue Apron and different, meal organizations, I think it's great. I think that, no matter how somebody starts on their food journey, wonderful. We have to be able to support them in that. And if it's something where they don't feel comfortable at all cooking, having something like a service where the meal's already prepared, if that's the way they get their nutrition, that's the way they get their nutrition. I personally would love it if they had something where they mixed it in with something. So if it's a complete meal that they, had some, like, okay, here's some greens I can add into it fresh, instead of having them, cooked until they're gray or something like that. I'm not saying that any of those organizations do that, but, really kind of looking at those ways that people can kind of look to be able to put their own stamp and their own signature on food, I think is really important. And it goes back to that cultural diversity thing too. So in those meal kits that people are getting, is it the same that comes across the entire, country? Is it different depending on where you're at? If you're in some place like completely diverse, like Washington, D.C., how do you look at that if you have a huge Ethiopian population or a huge Dominican population, and kind of looking at those different ways to be able to meet your audience, to be able to get the biggest nutrition and the biggest bang for their buck. So I think that it's great that they have meal kits like that. And if they are getting in systems to be able to help people afford those things, is great. I just wish that it was a little bit more mixed, to be able to add fresh ingredients into something, to be able to make it more nutritious, better flavor, because the fresher the food is, the better the flavor is going to be as well too. So so I definitely say it's a great thing to be able to start that way, but I'd like to be able to help that as a starting block and build upon it.
Yeah, I'll agree. I think that there are, just like we had in the other conversation about scratch versus processed foods, there's different gradations of, I think, what people might find to be successful with food delivery, meal delivery. I'm really most fascinated really by the model of distribution. I think that the Blue Aprons and the large food delivery companies have done amazing work figuring out logistics and transportation and distribution and some of these things. I don't think they're necessarily applying it in the right ways. I think there's huge opportunities to apply food distribution, to Dan's point, at the sort of hyper local nano level, at the neighborhood level even, and looking at it from the whole food system perspective of what food's available via just surplus from food producers, whether it's a primary producer like a farmer, or whether it's a secondary producer like a food service company that might have 10 or 20% excess food on a single day and not a place to go put it, or a bakery that might have a huge amount of bread on a single day and not a place to go put it. So I think there's a lot of really creative community-based solutions that can also solve for some hunger alleviation, from employment, even opportunities. All those boxes need to be packed by someone. I'd rather them be packed in a community, in a neighborhood, than in some warehouse someplace that no one even knows about. I also see it as a way to create different type of community involvement. Again, I always go back to food being an amazing cultural connector. And if it's more than just a box of food that you get, whether it's ingredients or prepared food, if embedded in the transaction is more than just the transaction of someone giving a box of food to someone, but there's a sharing or an exchange or an education or some other follow-up or piece that you can build from, that's the part I'm also particularly interested in, because then you have the potential from a cultural perspective, speaking as an anthropologist, to reproduce cultural norms and activities and behaviors so that the behavior is not knock on the door, receive the food, close the door and eat the food. It's an exchange where now it's like learning something, sharing something. Maybe that person at the receiving end becomes a person who becomes part of the distribution at some point, just as kind of a case study. So I think that there's a lot in there. I would rather the system not just be closed to say, yeah, we have a need, let's just put food on the front door and kind of walk away. I know that's not what they're doing, but I see just so much opportunity for greater engagement on those fronts.
Just to add on to that again too, I think that, those systems could partner really well with those local farms, and getting partnerships with community gardeners and community gardens as well. I think CSAs are a hugely beneficial thing for both the farmer and the customers to be able to get hyper local foods, and really by becoming a member of a CSA or something like that, it helps the farm as well as the customer as well. Because one of the things I love about CSA is you're never sure quite what you're going to get. So if you get something, you have to learn how to cook it if you've never seen it before. I think that's a great learning opportunity for some people as well. Now, different CSAs come at different price points as well, but you can get kind of bigger ones or smaller ones depending on where you are in the country. But to be able to see some of those kind of like Blue Apron programs, to be able to partner up with those local food distributors and farms, I think would be a huge win-win, not only for the people that are receiving the food, but the economic situations for the farmers as well.
Thanks, Dan. I want to apologize to Pedro Velasquez. Sorry, I misspoke your first name. That was just a communication snafu on our end. But moving on, we have another question from Paul Noglos that I think you guys will be interested to tackle. Is it too early to take away any learnings from COVID in terms of lifestyle and nutrition? I think, Paul says there was a fear that people would devolve into eating kind of the worst possible processed foods in the midst of the pandemic. And I think we've seen that wasn't really the case. So I'm curious what you all think. One, what has been the trends in food and nutrition during the pandemic? And do you think that they're going to stick?
I can only speak to what, I have observed and what I've noticed. We've definitely at Rouxbe seen some very interesting trends. Number one, just across the board, increased interest in learning to cook. So a lot more desire, a lot more demand for basic food literacy, basic foundational cooking skills. Rouxbe really focuses on cooking techniques and methods and kind of the whys and hows behind cooking, not just, we have the most recipes or anything like that. So people coming to us really want to learn to cook because they want to cook. A lot of them are just regular people who are at home cooking food that they wouldn't classify as being healthy or wellness oriented. And then we have a whole nother consumer market, which is 100% focused on health and wellness outcomes for themselves. And we've seen that market at Rouxbe expand greatly. So we have certain partners, in particular a partner called Forks Over Knives, which we co-developed and co-built a program with them that we deploy at Rouxbe, which is for for cardiac patients and for other people who want disease reversal or disease reversal support. And programs like that, where there's something very specific and very acute, have been in very, very high demand, I think in part because people have a much greater awareness around their own personal health and the relationship between what they eat, how they live, and their health. So we've seen it on both fronts, the general just need to cook, and also the more health-focused audience.
I think it's interesting the way that COVID has impacted the way that people cook at home too. When it first started, you saw like everybody doing like sourdough starters and baking as much bread as they could possibly do. And baking was a huge, huge thing. So, lots of gluten out there, which is great, but I think that kind of the people that kind of started off in this area of like, just kind of throwing things together are getting more practice over this, the longer they've been stuck inside. And those people that used to go to restaurants every single night are stuck in a place where they have to cook. And the more nights and the more days that they're doing that, the more that they're improving, the easier it's getting for them. And the more they're kind of waking up to being like, wow, I could have, paid $25 for this meal at a restaurant, but here I am making it at home for 4 people for $25, and it might taste better, So I think that that's an unbelievably great thing that we're going through. And to Ken's point, Ruby has taken off in their online classes as well. I've seen the same surge at Whole Kids, where we used to do all of our classes live in person, and we switched to an online version in December of last year, just by pure coincidence. And we saw a huge surge in our online classes taking off to be able to make this happen, where we're meeting teachers and educators where they are to be able to kind of make that jump for themselves. So I think that it's interesting to be able to see cooking in the time of COVID, because where before food was, huge on Instagram, and we're seeing all these different things where, like YouTube videos and all those things and how to cook, but COVID made it even more hyper, focused on that. Like, how do we get online to be able to figure out what kind of great meal I might have gotten at a restaurant, and looking at those maybe celebrity chefs to be able to make something, or looking at those chefs that aren't celebrities but are making something that their great grandmother made, and saying like, and I think that's one of the great things I love about that food culture through COVID as well, is, before things like on Instagram would be like, here's this one recipe, and people are very protective of it. But now you're seeing people that are like, I like that recipe, but how can I change that to meet the tastes of my family? And it's becoming this kind of shared culture of food, where people are sharing recipes again and looking at ways to be able to take food and alter it to be able to meet their the demands of their income, the demands of their family tastes. If you're going to make it kid friendly, or if it's something that's palatable for just adults, and I think that's a great thing that we're seeing, where it's not so much the focus on the unique plating and the fanciness of the dish, but the flavor profiles, looking at ways to be able to get families involved in the food as well. So you see a lot more kids cooking now, because it's an activity that they can do with their parents now, because everybody's stuck at home. So it's a great transformation in the food culture that has really kind of blown off the walls of, the box that we were in before. So I look at it as a huge positive aspect on that food culture that we're in, to be able to get more knowledge for people, and honestly for people that didn't have skills, to be able to build their skill level, day by day. And it's a wonderful thing to be able to see on that end of COVID. So at least we're getting something positive out of that.
Yeah, I want to ask Dan kind of just a follow-up to that, related to Richard Miller's question about, what can be done to encourage more healthy eating and the kind of the nutritional benefits. Crusonia Conversations are very focused on the idea that food is health, and helping, I think one of the big questions of the next, several decades will be, how do we make that connection for folks that to understand that food is more than just kind of a recreational activity or an essential to life, but is actually like closely related to things like health expenses and medical expenses. Dan, I want to push this to you first, because I think a lot of people, and I'm sure Whole Kids in a lot of ways saw this as well, think of school as a place to intercede with children, to expose them to another adult that isn't their parents, and give them opportunities to get kind of a different outlook on food. And then COVID happened, and then kids didn't go to school anymore. Kids were out of school for a very long time, and now they might be back, but in a limited capacity, and maybe they aren't eating at school, or maybe they aren't there for the whole day. So I don't know, as we move forward, what does the, eating outside the home versus eating inside the home, how do those kind of things change? And Ken, I'm going to bring you in on the second part of this question to ask, we also have seen, we went from a culture where everyone went, to work and then got lunch at a sandwich place near the office, something like that. And we've switched to, if we're all at home now, you have to make lunch with your family and you all sit down together. And are people going to want to go back to that?
Yeah, so that's actually a really good point. The food system has changed quite a bit in the past, even 4 years through, the USDA is largely in control of what meals are being put on plates at schools, and regulations got strict for a while, then they loosened up a little bit. And because of COVID, a lot of people were like, well, what are we going to do because of this? I love that Whole Kids really kind of jumped in to be able to help support these different districts in different ways for logistical questions. Just on like, schools aren't used to having to-go containers, right? So if you're delivering food to kids at their houses via school bus, like how do you do that, right? So there are some interesting things that happen with that. But on the nutrition aspect, the schools are still, if they're feeding kids, they still have to meet certain nutrition guidelines to be able to make sure that they're hitting nutritional standards, from a certain percentage of whole grains to a certain amount of vegetables, fruits, and protein sources. So, the school system are still being able to get a lot of those great meals to people, and they're doing it in a multitude of different ways. From some are doing even kind of meal kits, kind of Blue Apron-ish, but most of them are doing kind of standard meal that you'd get at the school, but they're not only doing it for the kids, they're doing it for the entire family, which really kind of opens up things. When they were in actual school systems, you did see a lot of the educators starting to inform themselves about nutrition. And when you look at teachers, that's great to be able to have them teaching lessons on nutrition and really kind of reaching outside of the classroom. One of the things we started doing very early at Whole Kids was giving garden grants away. So kids actually knew exactly where their food was coming from. So if they planted a seed, they watered it for a couple months and it comes out, and they get a food source to see exactly where their food is coming from. I think that kind of educational, portion of school is great, because you can take the classroom outside and you can learn all kinds of things that relate to science and nature just by looking at a school garden. And then we also have advocates that people don't think about, the food service professionals, they formerly called the lunch lady. The food service professionals are really on the front lines every single day, and they don't get as much credit as they should, because they are huge influencers in what a kid can eat. If they are going in a program where they're doing scratch cooking, typically you don't have 100% scratch cooking at every single school. You have that transition like I was talking about earlier. So if you had a kid that came through the line and every single day had chicken nuggets and French fries on their plate, not to say anything's wrong with either of those foods, but if they did it every single day, and say Maria, who made a lasagna from scratch that day, was like, hey, I made this lasagna from scratch today, you should try it. Just that little tiny sentence that she said there could influence that kid to try the lasagna and have that freshly made lasagna for the first time. And they might love it, and that's a huge shift from what they did in their heat to serve kind of thing every single day. And in that same vein, if that food service professional has a little bit more knowledge about nutrition, they can, be like, they can explain a little bit, but you'd have to do it in kids' terms, saying like the Eat the Rainbow is a great thing that kids understand. Or if there's something green in that lasagna, like spinach or something, they can say, it's a great thing to be able to eat your greens, because you get a lot of nutrition out of those greens than you would out of a lot of other things. So I think it's a wonderful way to be able to talk to kids about food by serving them what they're getting through those school systems, but also talk about the food that they're getting at home. We talked about the hyper-local part as well. I think that that's something a lot of people don't think about, is eating in season and, eating as close to the source as you possibly can. If you're eating in season and you're eating as close to the source, you're getting more nutrients, but you're also getting more flavor out of it too. So really getting a big punch of flavor out of that food equates that you're getting more nutrition out of that food too, if it has that, fresh off the vine. The further away it is from, the vine, if you think about tomatoes in the middle of December, like, it doesn't really taste like a tomato, but you have that same tomato in September, you're going to get a huge amount of flavor for that. And I think people start to understand that just from the flavor profile from getting that. If you try to have them try the tomato in both those months, they're going to start, having some light bulbs go off and be like, I'm starting to understand this a little bit more. So I think that that's a great way to be able to talk to people about food, is really kind of focusing on a little bit of nutrition and looking at ways to diversify their food that way.
Yeah, Dan, I was just, listening to you speak and kind of reliving some of the last few months and some of the conversations I've had, and even interactions I've had with my own kids and my family around food. And I've been working from home for the better part of a decade, and my whole family is now here, of course, at home. And just thinking about that reality and what it means for someone like me who cooks and we're already food people versus someone who, I think, to that point, Sarah, who wasn't accustomed to having that meal at home, who went off and just had lunch at work and their kids ate lunch at school, and maybe the only meal they shared together was dinner sometimes, right? Maybe not even most nights. So I think if it's done nothing else, the pandemic has showed many people, not all people, there are still lots and lots of families who don't have the pleasure or luxury of being able to be at home together during the pandemic. Let's not forget that. But for many families, their meal patterns, their togetherness around meals has really shifted. And I've heard from a lot of moms and dads that I know in my circles, just how much they've learned about their kids and their kids' food habits and food preferences by being forced to be with them all day and have 3 meals and snacks and all these things funneling through their own kitchen, not through someone else's kitchen. They're realizing, number one, like how much people eat and all that it takes to prepare and clean and prep and all those things. And for many people, they're actually finding some amount of joy or pleasure in parts of it. I wouldn't say all of it. It's certainly a lot of work. I do it. I cook. I clean. I try my best to keep up on it. I realize how much it is, and I'm fast. I'm efficient, right? So it's tough. But I think that the fact that it's actually creating new room for different conversations about food is incredibly positive. It's creating new types of questions and answers between parents and kids about, why do you like this? Why do you eat this? Giving people a real sense also that food habits and preferences are far from static. I think we have this idea that we're somehow like, marked from birth on the sorts of foods that we like or don't like based on our parents or based on where we live and these sorts of things. I find the opposite. I find people, the more they're exposed to different things, the more open they are to new things, and realizing that, yeah, maybe those Brussels sprouts that my dad used to cook were like undercooked or overcooked or not seasoned well or not seasoned at all or just really spicy, or gosh, he used ginger. I don't like ginger. I like everything else, but not ginger. Like, it's good to know those things and to have those experiences. So much of this for me has been around listening to people and understanding how their narrative around food has changed. I kind of chuckle when Dan was referring to the sourdough craze back in March and April. You couldn't even find yeast and you couldn't find flour. You couldn't so it was everything, sourdough this, sourdough that. That in itself, the fact that we can kind of collectively nod our head and say, yeah, we all were talking about that, or that became something that people who never even talked about sourdough were talking about, is sort of a little tiny pinpoint on the ability for food to shape that conversation, for it to have some meaning outside of just the act of consumption.
Yeah, I think that's such a compelling point. And something that you both mentioned kind of offline previously was the idea that your taste buds change every week and that you never know when food's going to taste different. So you have to keep trying and try again, especially with kids. I think that's a compelling place to we have to start kind of wrapping up this conversation. Of time for probably one more question, but I want to end on a high note, given that today is a bit of a stressful day kind of for all of us. So I wonder if you guys could leave us with, what is making you hopeful about the food system right now? Where do you think, what's giving you hope as you look ahead to the next, few decades in food?
Well, I think, just looking at what our kids are asking, I think is a huge thing that's making me hopeful. They're asking where their food came from. They're asking if they can help with the food. I think that part of our food system, or that part of our lives, is going to change the food system. And I think that's a huge hopeful thing to be able to look at, because the more kids ask questions and the more we can answer them with those, the more they can take that and really grow on it. I'm seeing an entire generation of young adults that are really, like they go to a grocery store and they turn the box around to see what ingredients are in it. And the previous generation never did that. They looked at the advertising on the front of the box, but never looked at the ingredient label to be able to see that. So seeing, young adults start by doing that is a huge change. And I think that, the generations underneath them too are still doing those same things. So seeing kids that are really interested in where their food is coming from, how it's made, what other things are in it, from different chemicals to GMOs to all kinds of things like that, I think is a super hugely, it's a wonderful thing to be able to see. And that makes me super hopeful for food in the upcoming generations, just seeing the questions that the kids are asking about them.
Yeah, gosh, that's great. One of the things I'm really hopeful for is, I think very similar to what Dan said in terms of the types of questions people are asking. What is that relationship to food that you have? What attributes meaning to you in your food? Is it something about the environment or health, or where it comes from, or who grew it, or how it was grown, or the story that came with that food? But I think, for me, the overarching thing that I look towards as being very hopeful and really a positive development within the food space is, for me, the shift away from the celebrity chef as the entertainer to the celebrity chef as a advocate, an activist, a person who can stand up and be a voice for the worker who had to cross the border undocumented, or for the worker who has to pick vegetables at a wage that none of us can even really conceive of, or the type of grit or determination it takes to keep a restaurant open right now, given everything involved with the pandemic and the cost of doing business and everything else. And the fact that we now have, chefs who really represent this country, women and men, young and old, from all different backgrounds, who can have a platform and are, beginning to develop really impressive and incredible, inspiring ways of changing these narratives that we have around food. And to me, that's just incredibly inspiring that young people today who think about becoming part of the food business don't just think about it because of the glamour or glitz of being on a TV show, but think about it from the perspective of, well, gosh, can I be like Jose Andres? Can I go feed people during a time of need? Can I be a chef who's concerned about health and help people turn around their heart disease? Like, these are the sorts of questions that people are asking now about food, and I just find it tremendously exciting.
Absolutely. What a perfect kind of ending to wrap us up on. First of all, I want to say thank you so much to all the members of the Crusonia Conversation community who followed along with our conversation today. I also want to offer a big thank you to Dan Marek and Ken Rubin for joining us for this conversation, and also to iSelect Fund and our other partners, which include Benson Hill, a partner of the Community Foundation of Greater Memphis, Cushman and Wakefield Commercial Advisors, EY, United Health, and Methodist La Bonheur Healthcare. I just want to remind everyone that Crusonia Conversations are free to attend, but unfortunately not to produce. So please consider donating to the Crusonia Fund. You can do that at crusoniaonthedelta.org, or click on the donation link in your follow-up email. And if you're looking to revisit today's conversation or to keep the Crusonia conversation going, be sure to follow our LinkedIn, Twitter, YouTube, and most importantly, our very lively Slack channel. There are always comments going on there, always good conversations. I am in there often, so hopefully I'll see some of you all there. And we also invite you to tell us what you liked or thought could be improved about this presentation in our follow-up survey. Links to all of these resources will be available in the email you'll receive following this event. So thank you all for joining us for another great Crusonia conversation. We'll see you all again soon.